Okay, so we'll just introduce ourselves again. So I look after all of the pro bono work that gets done at Baker Mackenzie, which is a pretty large global law firm that's headquartered in the UK, the US, and Australia. Catriona, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah,
again?
I am the pro bono senior associate at Fieldfisher. Fieldfisher is predominantly a and we have a very large tech and privacy division. So as a result, have a small division in Silicon Valley as well. So we're looking at it both from the point of view of what do we need our lawyers to be able to advise clients on, but also what do we want our lawyers to come in generally to have experience of tech and generative AI in their day job, whether they're in that team or not.
And because we're both pro bono professionals, we have a bit of a pro bono slant to this talk as well. And I know that there are some clinical legal educationalists in the room.
No, just
mute you, whoever's talking. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about over the next sort of maybe 10 minutes really is how AI and pro bono can be used to skill up lawyers at law firms, how it can address but also exacerbate a skills gap between lawyers, the risks associated with AI, and also this notion of the billable hour and whether that is once and for all dying a death. Now, as I mentioned before, both Catriona and I come from corporate commercial law backgrounds. So we are speaking with that voice. So we are mindful that we are not representative of the legal sector more widely. However, Catriona specifically has experience in other sectors, and I'll leave you, Catriona, to explain that.
Thank you, Emma. So I've been at Fieldfisher for approximately 2 years, but my background is not as a commercial lawyer. I started work as a legal aid lawyer, and then after my role was made redundant because of the LASBO cuts, I moved into in-house charity sector work where I ran advice teams for approximately 10 years. So I have a good understanding of some of the challenges that sector in particular has around the adoption of AI and legal tech more broadly, and the different skill sets that you really need to be able to have as a lawyer sitting in that space rather than the commercial space.
Right. So then let's start by looking at skilling up, how AI can be used to skill up lawyers once they enter the profession.
So is that me, Emma? Sorry, I can't see you, so I'm taking my cues. Yes, so I mean, as it's already been discussed in the context of education, it's unsurprising that firms such as ours are looking for legal tech confident trainees. And what I mean by that is not necessarily trainees who come in understanding all of the different permutations of legal tech that are available, but need to be able to pick it up quickly and confidently. And as one of the previous speakers said, there is an expectation to some extent that trainees coming into our firms are going to be digitally native far better than a lot of the existing fee earners. And Emma will talk to that point a bit later. When Emma and I were preparing for this, I was reflecting on the fact that I'm old enough to remember when you put on your CV the fact that you were proficient in using Outlook and PowerPoint as if it was, an important skill set that's made you stand out from everybody else. And obviously that's just an expectation today, and I think that's quickly where we are moving to, particularly in the use of generative AI, the expectation that because and it's sped up because of the expectation that because people are using it in their private life as well as professionally, that there's just going to be a knowledge base that exists in how to use it. But the question then is, how are people using it, and do they have the knowledge to be using it safely and ethically in the way that the law firms expect them to? Emma, over to you, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's a really valid point about how probably a lot of us do use AI in our personal lives, whether we use it to design our meals or to help us sort out our holiday plans. That's certainly the two things that I use it most frequently for. But that's a very safe space when you're in your public life, because you're not worried about confidential data. When you're working in a law firm, there are so many guardrails set up to make sure that you're not using confidential data or feeding that into what could potentially be a piece of AI tech that then is made public, that I think there is a bit more reluctance to use it in a professional setting for that very reason. So that's why pro bono work is actually a really good way of practicing how to use AI in a professional context, because that's where you learn how to use these guardrails, how they're going to work, and how you're making sure that you're keeping your clients' confidentiality appropriately. And so using pro bono as a sandpit, as we like to say, to practice these skills, develop these skills, experiment with these skills is very, very helpful. And often we see people using pro bono in that way. But on the flip side of that, where the skills that are required to use AI effectively might be less client facing and less calling on less of those softer skills, pro bono develops those skills also. Pro bono develops those skills also. So the only way you can get certain skills like empathy and listening and effectively building rapport and trust with your client is by being in front of a client. And at a big corporate firm like Baker Mackenzie, like Fieldfisher, you might not get to do that for 5, 6, 7 years after you qualify. And so you can use pro bono to augment those skills that you're maybe using for AI in a client-facing role as well. And Catriona, you had an example about the use of AI in pro bono work.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. So at Fieldfisher, like a lot of firms, we are testing out the different ways in which we can use, in particular, generative AI safely. And I think that's one of the, just kind of a sort of side point to that, one of the challenges that universities have in preparing their students going into law firms is that all of the law firms have kind of got different temperatures and risk appetites when it comes to this at the moment. So some are remaining extremely conservative in the adoption, others are much more forward thinking. But obviously we all share the concerns around data and privacy, etc., etc. So I think so what we are doing is we have prioritized the work that we do with some of our university partners in our pro bono clinics to test out how we might use some of these tools safely. So at the moment, we are using Copilot to build an agent to assist on our disability form filling clinic that we do with one of our pro bono partners in London. And that is going to allow students working with our fee earners who supervise the students during those client interviews to speed up the time in which they are taking to do the appointments, but also hopefully not asking the clients to share personal information which isn't necessarily relevant to the claim that they're making, which we have found. So in an extreme example on that clinic, we had a 3-hour appointment for a client who just wasn't sure what they were sharing. And we had some students who perhaps were struggling a little bit in that appointment. And so we had vast amounts of personal information that was just completely irrelevant to the claim. So that, takes up a lot of time. And also the client is sharing information that perhaps they just didn't otherwise want to. Using the Copilot agent, we built prompts which work in conjunction with the descriptors that are set out in the regulations for the disability benefit, so that we can really hone the questions. So to Emma's point around the fact that pro bono is a really good way of honing those skills of empathy and client engagement, etc., that actually is assisting in these circumstances rather than detracting for it. In another case, we work on an innocence project, and we are using our e-disclosure system, which has an AI agent built into it now, which is going to speed up immensely the amount of time it will take for us to analyse paperwork for people who are sitting in prison waiting to see if they can make an application to have their appeal, to have their case overturned. And again, it's assisting the university in the sense that, as you all know way better than me, the lack of administrative support means that when we get the documents, it's one huge PDF. It's very difficult for us to analyse effectively, and it can take a very long time for the fee earners and the students to really grapple with the evidence that they're trying to hone in on. So by using this system, we're able to get it onto the system. We can get it correctly, the correct naming conventions, and then we can start running questions through the agent, looking for the specific points of appeal and the evidence that we want to seek. A third one, which we haven't started yet, but we will be around our general legal advice clinic. And that will be where we are going to be testing out with students anonymously to get them to compare the use of a closed system, which is pulling information to that agent from known and trusted sources, versus an open source system. And so and letting the students really see the difference in the quality of advice that is given. Because at Fieldfisher, like most firms, we're banning our fee earners from using ChatGPT on our systems. But does that mean that when they're working from home that they're using it? We can't stop them. And so what we need to make sure is that our lawyers are still using that critical thinking and understanding that just because it's a quick response doesn't mean that it's the correct response. And so I think really thinking about how we embed this into our university pro bono clinics going forward is an additional way of making sure that these students are prepared for when they go into the workforce.
Thanks very much, Catriona. So moving on to this idea that AI can help heal, but also do further harm when it comes to the skills gap at law firms. Law firms like Catriona and mine are incredibly hierarchical. I mean, the point would cut you at the very top of that hierarchy. It's so sharp. And yet we're seeing people enter these law firms who are far more digitally literate than the people that they are reporting to. It's exactly the same as what you were saying, Cameron, about students coming to university oftentimes more digitally literate than their teachers. And so how can universities help prepare students potential clash of someone coming in who's a digital native into a very, very hierarchical environment? How can trainees navigate that system? I don't profess to know the answers, but I think it's probably something worth making your students aware of, that there is this issue at the moment. So maybe it's for law firms to adopt, to borrow from a pedagogical term, a flipped classroom approach, where the more senior people are learning from the more junior people about AI and legal tech in a way that probably the legal sector is more reluctant to adopt than maybe other sectors who might be more open to that kind of flattening of the hierarchy. And I'm just, your point, Andy, you had that lovely slide up that said, does AI make you stupid? I guess what the trainees entering the profession are thinking is, does not using AI make you stupid? Because I think they would probably say yes. So Catriona, over to you.
Thank you, Emma. Just following on from that point, I mean, as we've seen kind of generally, law firms are a good ecosystem of the different appetites, I guess, that people have generally for the adoption of this and their fears and concerns around it. And one of the ongoing conversations within the law firms is one around what does this mean in some of the skills that people have around research and critical thinking that I've touched on already, but also this kind of ongoing fear that irrespective of generative AI, that new generations of lawyers coming in are struggling with certain interpersonal skills like phone calls and being able to converse with clients face to face. And so again, in the roles that Emma and I have, we have been using pro bono to really push some of those skills because, as Emma's already said, the trainees get far more access to clients, running cases, being much more responsible end to end than they would be in any fee-paying work. So what we have done at Fieldfisher, which we had done before the pandemic, was pro bono is now mandatory again as part of a training contract. We suspended that during the pandemic, and then for a couple of years afterwards, it was felt we didn't need to mandate it because enough trainees were taking it up. But actually, it's becoming a very important part of learning and development during the course of the training contract. So now, as I say, it's a mandatory part of people doing it in their second and third seat. And whilst I have some trainees who sigh and roll their eyes at me when I tell them that, the majority of them, by the time we get to the end of that process, are very grateful that they have, so that they have been able to kind of hone some of those skills as well.
Great. So that's the sort of skills gap section, and now we're going to move on to the risks.
So as has already been mentioned, obviously we saw in the press the Haringey Law Centre case where case law was produced and put into the High Court, which were hallucinated. And this is an ongoing concern that obviously everybody has, particularly in law, around the ability to do that. But I think particularly thinking about the law students, there's been a sort of wider concern that certainly we've been starting to pick up in the commercial sector, which is around the general erosion of the rule of law, and generative AI's part in that. So we've had ongoing, we have seen politically across the spectrum that general concern around the sort of understanding of the importance of the rule of law in the general public. And the generative AI in these circumstances has the potential to really bolster that, but it also has the potential to erode it further. And so I think, again, using pro bono work, it's a really good way of holding this as an important part in law students' minds. And I'm not professing that Emma and I are going to solve all of the problems of the erosion of the rule of law through a couple of clinics, but what it does do is it gives a very specific examples to our students, our fee earners working in it, around because I think when you're working, particularly when you're working in a law firm, there's this kind of fundamental assumption that everyone understands the importance of the rule of law. Everyone understands why it's important to having this functioning state that underlies a functioning government and society. But actually, when you step out of that, that's not necessarily the case. So certainly from our perspective, it's also about how do you use AI ethically to educate both internally within our business services, but also more broadly, this concept of the rule of law that we've always taken for granted, but is currently under threat.
And that's Lucia, you put up on the slides the policies that you have here. I think really drilling into students that these policies, if you become a lawyer, are the difference between you being allowed to continue to practice or being struck off, is pretty important. So the ethical, the guardrails, the boundaries that are set up for us as practicing solicitors, barristers, etc. They're not to be taken lightly, and learning that at law school will be very, very helpful when they move into the profession.
Yeah, sorry, can I just jump in really quickly on that? I think, you know, with GDPR having been around for so long, and data protection policies, to some extent it's really easy to see the AI and ethical policies as just another policy that you have to read and then it sits on a shelf. But I think, you know, to Emma's point, I would agree that it's incredibly important that the students and our lawyers understand that this is a very live document that they need to be attuned to all of the time. I think, you know, there's a general conversation happening in the legal profession that because we haven't had any further guidance from the regulator on the use of it, and their stance at the moment is you have your ethical obligations set out in the code of conduct. We don't need to say anything else. Everyone is expecting a big case, bigger than the Haringey case, to happen involving someone doing something very stupid with generative AI. And none of us want that to be our lawyers or our students as future lawyers. So just really drumming it in that this is something that they just have to have live in their mind all the time is just going to make them much better prepared when they go into the workforce.
So the last point that Catriona and I want to make is about the billable hour, but I'm just very conscious that some people might not know about the billable hour. So just very quickly, when you're in practice, you record your time in increments of 6 minutes, and then you bill your client accordingly, and that's known as the billable hour. Catriona and I were at a conference earlier this year on legal tech, and we heard a lot from in-house counsel, so a lot from lawyers that work in companies that then call upon firms like Fieldfisher and Mackenzie to do the kind of the more tricky stuff. And so we heard from in-house counsel, and time again, they were saying they expect AI to mean, if used effectively and properly by their law firms, they expect AI to mean that there was no more billable hour. They're not going to be billed by the hour. Instead, the work is going to be done on fixed fees, and it's going to cost less because law firms are going to be run much more effectively and efficiently, and which will mean that they'll be able to see how long a particular task will take, and that will mean then that in-house teams will not get these astronomical bills that are billed on an hourly basis. We don't know if that's going to be the case. I mean, the death of the billable hour has been announced for decades now, but maybe this is going to be the end of the billable hour. It's important for students to understand then coming into the profession that it is changing and that clients' expectations are changing, and they might be expected to do something in half the time using AI, but with Haringey Law Centre in the back of their mind saying, yes, I've only got half the time. I still need to do it properly, because if I don't, I could lose my job and I could land my law firm in deep water. And just to kind of finish up from me before I hand over to Catriona finally, is that whilst this might have big law firms like mine and Catriona's up all night worrying about the death of the billable hour, it could mean for legal aid firms that they could potentially make their work more financially viable through the use of AI, because they're used to working on a fixed fee model. And so with the use of AI, they might actually be able to maximize the amount of work they can produce within that fixed fee model. So potentially some good news for legal aid firms. I don't know. We'll wait and see. Catriona, over to you.
Thanks, Emma. I mean, yes, as a former legal aid lawyer, I'm particularly interested and excited that actually might solve some of the major issues that we have in access to justice. But more broadly, I think, you know, as kind of the running theme of all of the conversations this morning is we are going through a huge period of technological change, and as a result, we're certainly seeing within Fieldfisher that comes with different levels of emotions from fee earners at the moment. It's making a big cultural shift, and so particularly for those law students who are probably starting to think about getting training contracts in the next couple of years, just a kind of general point of being quite resilient and adaptable to that change is something which they're going to have to contest with in a way that we haven't before. You know, the fact that we've worked on this billable hour and hierarchical model for as long as we have is an indicator that, you know, law isn't, whilst the law itself is flexed to change, lawyers as a species, perhaps we're not so good at it in our ecospheres. So it's something which I am acutely aware of with the students that are coming into the firm from next year, that when they interviewed for us 2 years ago, it is now a very different firm within those 2 years that they are coming into, and how we, the responsibilities that we have, obviously as an employer, is something we need to think about, but also what can those students be doing with their universities to really prepare for that is something else that I would really urge everyone in the room to think about. And yes,